Hello, and welcome to this pre-recorded feedback event for the BTEC Level 2 Firsts in Information and Creative Technology, feedback on June 2015, External Assessment Unit 2, Technology Systems. To help you get the most out of this feedback, you may want to have the following documents handy, as we will refer to them during the session. Unit Specification, Exam Paper, Mark Scheme, Examiner's Report. Operative Verbs. This document clarifies the command words and verbs used at each level for all versions of the external assessments. Here are the aims and objectives of today's session. You will receive feedback on performance of learners, consider questions where significant numbers of learners underperformed and possible reasons why, discuss the lead examiner's report, consider delivery strategies and share good practice, address common issues, find out about further support available. We have a lot to cover in this event, so let's get started. I am now going to introduce you to the Unit's assessment requirements. Please open the Unit 2 specification document. As you can see, the unit is split into 3 learning aims. All versions of the external assessment addressed all of the learning aims A, B, and C. The questions within the paper were spread across Level 1 and Level 2, Pass, Merit, and Distinction. The test itself is online, on demand. The test has a mixture of multi-choice, open, closed, and extended answers. The test starts with a Level 1 question, with merit and distinction questions coming later in the test. Level 1 and pass questions are distributed randomly throughout the test. The last question, question 18, provides the opportunity for the learner to provide an extended response, for example, discuss, and is marked using a level-based mark scheme. Test duration is 1 hour. 50 marks are available for the test. Exam opportunities or scheduling is important. The test should be taken after the underpinning knowledge has been delivered. Reset opportunities should be scheduled to allow sufficient time to prepare the learner for the resit exam. We have found that learners' achievements improve if the exam is taken towards the end of the course. Consider scheduling the initial exam for January and resit opportunity March, or initial exam March and resit for June. Ensure that sufficient time is allowed for exam preparation for the initial test and resit opportunity. The next few slides provide a summary of the test structure and learners' performance. The early part of the test is aimed at Level 1 and Level 2 pass, and at these levels, learners are typically required to recall facts, perform basic procedures, and apply basic understanding to familiar topics and scenarios. As the test progresses, learners are expected to apply more in-depth understanding. Questions at this level may require a learner to describe or explain their understanding, which should prompt linked, in-depth responses that show broader, deeper knowledge of the subject matter. Where appropriate, learners should apply their response to a given vocational scenario. The final question of the test requires an extended response and is designed to differentiate at pass, merit, and distinction levels. Overall, most learners were able to respond well to questions earlier in the test, especially where questions related to more common, everyday computer use. Where learners' performance was less successful, across the whole of the test, two main characteristics were evident. 1. Learners often did not respond in a way that was expected by the command verb. For example, responses to explain questions often did not provide suitable linked expansions and demonstrated only a superficial understanding of the subject matter. 2. Many learners did not demonstrate sufficient breadth and depth of knowledge across the whole specification, particularly in relation to more technical subjects. There is also evidence that many candidates do not have the understanding of core technical vocabulary. Generally, we found that learners coped well with the on-screen testing mechanisms and were able to complete the test in the allotted time. However, performance in some areas could be improved, particularly in questions where more open responses are required. Please open the Operative Verbs document. This document clarifies the command words and verbs used at each level for all versions of the external assessments. Most learners are not aware of the depth of response required at each of the levels. Pass verbs, merit verbs, distinction verbs. The operative verbs provide some guidance as to the depth of responses required at each level, especially in the final extended written questions. At this point, you may wish to pause the recording and look at the operative verbs and descriptors. In this section, we will look at example questions, how marks are awarded, and lead examiner comments. Please open the question paper, mark scheme, and Chief Examiner report. The next few slides will look at questions where learners did well. This is the first question in the paper, and is an accessible multiple-choice question. Learners need to identify their chosen response, and it asks the learner to identify one way to prolong the battery life of a laptop computer. Most learners performed well in this question and achieved this mark. It was evident that this topic had been delivered by centres in some detail. The majority of learners were able to show an understanding and correctly identify the correct way to prolong battery life when using a tablet computer. Learners who did not provide the correct response demonstrated a lack of understanding of how the features of mobile devices affect performance in light of battery life. For this question, learners needed to identify two features of professional CAD systems. As you can see, this is another multiple-choice question. Most learners were able to identify at least one of the two correct answers relating to the use of professional CAD systems. It was evident that this topic had been delivered by centres in some detail, and that some discussion of various applications of technical systems used in different sectors had taken place. There were some learners that were not able to identify features of a CAD system and lost marks, as the response demonstrated a lack of knowledge of the applications of technology systems and technical requirements of a CAD system. A common mistake here was, they create designs automatically. While some processes or tasks may be automated, such as rescaling, etc., the creation of the design itself would still be performed by the user. For For this question, learners were asked to name two main components of a heat dispersal system. This is an open response question, and the learner should have responded with a single-word answer. Question 1. Heat sink, 1 mark. Question 2. Fan, 1 mark, and have been awarded 2 marks. They were not required to provide any expansion. The learners that performed well in this question demonstrated a good understanding of the characteristics and function of the heat dispersal system, and were able to identify both component parts. It is important that the learners have a well-rounded understanding of all elements of the specification. Some learners lost marks, as the response demonstrated a lack of knowledge of the internal components of a computer system specification and technical requirements of a heat dispersal system. This question, question 7, was presented in 2 parts. Part A is asking the learner to name, 1 mark. This is a pass-level question, where the learner is required to recall correctly and apply the correct response within the question context. It is more challenging than a Level 1 direct response question. Part B is asking the learner to describe, 2 marks. 1 mark is awarded for the correct identification at pass level, and the additional mark for appropriate expansion at merit. This is an open response question and allows the learner opportunity to access the merit points. As you can see, 1 mark was awarded for Part A and 2 marks for Part B. Most learners performed well in both parts of the question. Part A. Learners identified that the system would use a sensor as an input device, many of which were able to demonstrate understanding that a heat sensor or thermistor would be used. Part B. Learners were able to identify that actuators were systems output devices for 1 mark, and gained the extension mark by providing an appropriate expansion by describing how they respond to instructions from the processor to control or activate the movement of the blinds. This is a 2-mark question and an opportunity for the learners to provide a merit response and access 2 marks. Most learners were able to identify that the system would use a sensor as an input device and access the 1st mark. But some were unable to describe the role of the actuators in the external blind system. This demonstrated a lack of knowledge of the specification and technical requirements of computer hardware devices. The responses could also be better improved if the correct terminology was used. It is important to reflect the learner's technical understanding of computer hardware devices. The next slides show examples of why learners accessed less marks on certain questions. This question was presented in 3 parts, A, B, and C, asking the learner to identify elements of a utility program. Most learners were able to correctly identify disk defragmentation programs and a type of utility software for Part A, and 1 mark was awarded. For Part B, no marks were awarded for cleans the disk. The lead examiner reported that the overall performance on Part B was poor. Only a small number of students were able to provide the correct response and identify one of the processes that occurs during defragmentation. Where students gained credit, this was typically for identifying that related data is grouped together during the defragmentation process. As you can see for Part C, no mark was awarded for hard disk runs faster. Part C was generally not answered well. It was evident that the role of utility applications had not been delivered by centres in detail, and discussions of the concepts of operating systems and application had not taken place. The lead examiner reported that there were typically two main characteristics to the learner responses. 1. Generic answers that do not demonstrate an understanding of the processes involved. For example, faster. This response, for example, does not gain credit. The hard disk runs faster. A more appropriate response would be faster load times. 2. Many learners did not clearly understand the process of defragmentation. Most learners showed a basic understanding of utility applications. However, a broader technical understanding needs to be reflected in the response. The general performance of learners on this question highlights a common issue that occurs throughout the test, namely that many learners do not demonstrate sound understanding of some of the core technical knowledge of the specification. The responses could also be better improved if the correct terminology was used. It is important to reflect the learner's technical understanding of computer hardware devices. Acceptable responses are: to fetch instructions and commands, to decode instructions and commands, to execute, carry out, handle instructions and commands. Performs calculations would also have been accepted. This is a 2-mark explain question targeted at 1 pass mark and 1 merit mark, and is asking the learner to explain one other use of the disk cache specified. As you can see, the learner has been awarded 1 mark for the correct identification. The expansion mark was not awarded. The lead examiner reported that some learners showed a basic understanding of disk cache and gained 1 mark for this question, but they were restricted from gaining 2 marks by not providing a suitable linked expansion. The majority of the learners did not demonstrate a basic understanding of the internal components of a computer, and that a broader technical understanding of each of the elements needs to be reflected in the response, especially to gain the expansion mark. Learners should ensure that they have read the question carefully, as here, one example was provided in the question. It is important that the learners read the question carefully. They should also avoid using words that are within the question in their own responses, which will result in a loss of marks. Learners also lost marks where they failed to answer the question in full or misinterpreted the question's requirement. Activity 1, Question 13. Now that you have seen how marks are awarded, it would be beneficial at this point to undertake an activity that will help you apply the mark scheme to a learner response. Look at the learner response for Question 13, Part A and Part B. Using the mark scheme for Question 13, what mark would you award? Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you with this. You may wish to pause the video to carry out this activity. Let's look at what marks were awarded by the examiner. As you can see from the comments, 1 mark was awarded for Part A and 1 mark for Part B. Part A. 1 mark awarded for the correct identification responds to verbal commands. The expansion mark was not awarded. To award the expansion mark, there needs to be an explanation as to why it improves accessibility for some users. For example, so there is no need to use a physical input device, or for users unable to use a keyboard or other physical input device. The lead examiner identified that learners typically gained credit for identifying that the computer responded to verbal commands, or that it provided access for users who had some form of disability. Learners often did not demonstrate deeper understanding and did not provide appropriate linked responses as expected to be awarded the expansion mark. Part B. 1 mark was awarded for the correct identification. The extension mark was not awarded. A linked response was required as to how the screen reader interface provides verbal feedback. For example, using speech synthesis or text-to-voice software, based on additional data such as alt text. Part B was not answered well, with most students unable to demonstrate an understanding of the output provided by a screen reader interface. Common errors here related to changing the size or color of the on-screen display, rather than how it provides audio output. This screen shows an example of how full marks can be awarded. Here we see a 2-mark response to Part A, 1 mark awarded for correct identification, and 1 additional mark for appropriate linked expansion. Here we see a 2-mark response to Part B. Again, 1 mark awarded for correct identification and 1 additional mark for appropriate linked expansion. The lead examiner reported that it was clear that this section of the specification content regarding operating systems and applications had been covered well. It was evident that many learners demonstrated a good understanding of the concepts and function of speech recognition. Activity 2, Question 15. Using the mark scheme for Question 15, what mark would you award? Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you with this. You may wish to pause the video to carry out this activity. Activity 2, Question 15, Awarding. This question is asking the learner to explain 2 other benefits a solid-state disk would provide. 4 marks in total are available for this question, and all of the marks were awarded. For each benefit, 1 mark is awarded for the correct identification, and 1 additional mark for appropriate expansion. For the first example, the learner was able to identify 2 distinct benefits a solid-state disk would provide, which have been clearly defined with a linked resource. For the second example, the mark point was taken from quieter operation, 1, as the drive does not contain moving parts, 1. The actual response is an inversion of the mark scheme, but because it is linked and still makes sense, both marks can be awarded under Accept any valid response. Let's look at why learners did well in this question. Learners demonstrated their technical understanding of a solid-state disk and were able to provide the correct identification and appropriate expansion to explain 2 other benefits a solid-state disk would provide. Many responses provided suitable linked explanations that expanded on the identified benefits. It was clear that this section of the specification, computer hardware devices, had been covered well, and that many learners demonstrated a good understanding of the benefits a solid-state disk would provide. Learners who read the question carefully provided a response that allowed them to explain 2 other benefits a solid-state disk would provide. They disregarded the benefit identified in the question. We will now examine why the learners did not perform well in this question. Some learners lost marks as the response demonstrated a lack of knowledge of the specification area, computer hardware devices, and the features, characteristics, and implications of solid-state disks. It is important that the learners read the question carefully and provide the required depth of response, that is, the correct identification and appropriate linked expansion. There were a few learners who provided 2 distinct responses, but they were the same response reworded. It is important that learners understand the need to provide clear and distinct responses for these type of questions. They also need to understand that 1 mark is awarded for correct identification and 1 additional mark for appropriate expansion. Therefore, they were restricted from gaining 2 marks by not providing a suitable linked expansion. Learners should read the question carefully. Although 1 benefit was given in the question, some learners repeated this benefit in their response. Some learners did not provide a correct identification and appropriate linked expansion. Therefore, they were restricted from gaining 2 marks by not providing a suitable linked expansion. Activity 3, Question 16. Using the mark scheme for Question 16, what mark would you award? Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you with this. You may wish to pause the video to carry out this activity. Activity 3, Question 16, Awarding. 3 marks are available in total, but only 2 marks were awarded for this question. Part A is asking the learner to identify 1 example when conversion from digital to analog output is necessary. 1 mark awarded for identifying an example of conversion. The learner had clearly covered the unit specification requirement and demonstrated good subject knowledge. This question was awarded 1 mark. The lead examiner reported that this question was answered well, with most students able to identify a suitable example of a use of digital to analog conversion. Part B is asking the learner to explain 1 reason why binary numbers are used to represent digital data for this response. 2 marks available for this question. 1 mark was awarded for the identification. Expansion mark was not awarded. The lead examiner reported that most learners were not able to identify a reason that binary is used. That is, that it is made up of 1s and 0s, to access the first mark. Often responses did not provide a linked expansion that would have gained the second mark. That is, that this is equivalent to the on-off state of digital data. The learner's exam techniques, subject knowledge, and specification coverage affected the learner's performance in this question. Activity 4, Question 17. This is Question 17 and was developed to allow the learner access to the higher mark bands. It is an open response question and is asking the learner to explain why ROM is used to store a computer's basic input-output system, BIOS. Using the mark scheme for Question 17, what mark would you award? Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you with this. You may wish to pause the video to carry out this activity. As you can see, no marks were awarded for this question. The learner was asked to explain why ROM is used to store a computer's BIOS. 1 mark available for correct identification and 1 additional mark available for appropriate linked expansion. The learner has taken the question words and rewritten them in their response. We will now examine why the learners did not perform well in this question. The learners were not fully aware of the technical requirements of Learning Aim B1, internal components of a computer. This question required the learners to apply understanding of the features and characteristics of ROM to a given scenario. In this case, its use to hold BIOS information. Typical errors here confused ROM and RAM, while many stated that BIOS is held in ROM, as it will never be changed. Another common error is a regular misunderstanding of the difference between memory and storage. Learners should explore the uses of different memory types and their features. For example, volatile and non-volatile, which makes them suitable for certain roles. Learners should be able to apply this knowledge to a range of scenarios, specification rider statements, and indicative content. Learners often did not demonstrate deeper understanding, and often did not provide appropriate linked responses as expected from an explain question. They also need to understand that 1 mark is awarded for correct identification and 1 additional mark for appropriate expansion. Focusing on exam techniques could also help the learner to access available marks. We will now examine why learners did well in this question. Learners demonstrated their technical understanding of the internal components of a computer and were able to provide the correct identification and appropriate expansion to explain why ROM is used to store a computer's BIOS. It was clear that this section of the specification had been covered well, and that many learners demonstrated a good understanding of the benefits a solid-state disk would provide. Many responses provided suitable linked explanations that expanded on the identified benefits. Learners read the question carefully and provided a response that allowed them to explain why ROM is used to store a computer's BIOS. Activity 5, Question 18. This is the last question on the paper. It provides the opportunity for learners to demonstrate deeper understanding of parts of the specification and to access 8 marks. Look at the learner response for Question 18. Using the mark scheme, what mark would you award for this question? Pause the recording and look at the example. Using the mark scheme, decide what mark you think should be awarded and why. Activity 5, Question 18, Awarding. This is the learner's response to Question 18, with an explanation of how the marks were awarded. Mark Band 1. 3 marks were awarded as the learner has identified a few key points. The answer is in the form of a list. As we can see, the response focuses on 5 main points, which in this case is enough to demonstrate a broad enough understanding of the topic area. To access the higher mark bands, for each point made, the learner needs to demonstrate a depth of understanding by identifying reasons and linking examples and explanations. The mark scheme will guide you through the awarding of the levels. The lead examiner identified that this response is typical of the responses seen for this question, which shows that this subject area was not clearly understood by the learner. Learners were not able to provide a discussion of the factors that should be considered before installing a new operating system. Activity 6. Question 18, Awarding. This is another learner's response to Question 18, with an explanation of how the marks were awarded. Mark Band 2. 5 marks were awarded. As we can see, the response focuses on 4 main points. The learner has identified 3 key points and provided a description of the other point. Software compatibility, access rights, and staff training points are relevant, but could be expanded further. Consideration of more than one viewpoint was carried out for issues surrounding the installation of the new OS, using the software to complete the office tasks easier and quicker. There was more emphasis on the negative effects of installing the new OS. Therefore, the answer is unbalanced. Most points were relevant to the situation, but not described. The links are not specifically related to Farhana's requirements and her considerations, and therefore inhibits the learner accessing the higher mark band. Please refer to the mark scheme for Question 18 mark bands. The lead examiner reported that this section of the specification was not covered well. Some learners did do well in this extended question, but some learners lost marks due to learners made a good number of individual points but did not provide appropriate expansion, discussion, or reasoning, and as such were restricted to mark band 1. While many learners did provide some context and explanation of some of their identified points, and as such moved to mark band 2, very few learners were able to provide sufficient evidence of performance at mark band 3. Quality of written technical communication sometimes made it difficult to understand the learner's response. At the lower mark band levels, there are often errors in the use and application of technical vocabulary and basic technical knowledge, which often hamper demonstration of understanding. Responses were often not logically linked, and reasoning, explanations, and expansions are often superficial or not appropriately linked to the given scenario. The key message in responding to this type of question is balance, and the learners should be able to consider the pros and cons of each point that they make and provide some sort of exemplification. Learners should be encouraged to undertake evaluative work wherever possible, both in relation to the topics being studied and their working practices. There was a lack of specification understanding. Most learners showed a basic understanding of the factors that should be considered before installing a new operating system. However, a broader technical understanding needs to be reflected in the response. Learners should be able to apply this knowledge to a range of scenarios, specification rider statements, and indicative content. The responses could also be better improved if the correct terminology was used, as it is important to reflect the learner's technical understanding. Lack of exam techniques. It is important that the learners read the question carefully and provide the correct depth of response. For example, to discuss is where all sides of the case are considered and the answer is well balanced, giving weight to all viewpoints. The majority of points made will be relevant, and there will be a clear link to the situation in the question. The extended writing questions provide learners with an opportunity to demonstrate depth and breadth of specification knowledge and technical skills on a given area by deconstructing a given scenario and providing numerous factual points and linked chains of reasoning. Why learners did well on this question. Good use of technical vocabulary and technical knowledge, which demonstrated understanding of the topic requirement. Within each section, the learners demonstrated depth of understanding by identifying reasons and linking examples and explanations. The learners provided a discussion of the key points in depth. All sides of the case were considered, and the answer was well balanced, giving weight to all viewpoints. Responses linked to the scenario. The lead examiner stated that the test was designed to prompt linked, in-depth responses that show broader, deeper knowledge of the subject matter. Most learners were able to respond well to questions earlier in the test, especially where questions related to more common, everyday computing. However, learners often did not respond in a way that was expected by the command verb. For example, responses to explain questions often did not provide suitable linked expansions and demonstrated only a superficial understanding of the subject matter. It was also evident that many learners did not demonstrate sufficient breadth and depth of knowledge across the whole specification, particularly in relation to more technical subjects. Learners should be able to apply this knowledge to a range of scenarios, specification rider statements, and indicative content. Centers are encouraged to review the lead examiner report, as it provides detailed analysis on the performance of the learners and guidance for further test preparation. I would like to summarize some of the common issues found during this examination series. It was sometimes evident that the specification had been delivered by centers in some detail, and that discussion had taken place, due to the depth of technical responses seen. However, the majority of the learners had not achieved a depth of understanding of all of the learning aim requirements to access the higher mark bands. However, it was also apparent that some learners lost marks as the response demonstrated a lack of knowledge of the specification and technical requirements of the topic areas. Most learners showed a basic understanding of the specification. However, a broader technical understanding needs to be reflected in the response. Learners also lost marks where they failed to answer the question in full. Some learners misinterpreted the question's requirements. It is important that learners understand the need to provide clear and distinct responses for these type of questions. They also need to understand that 1 mark is awarded for correct identification and 1 additional mark for appropriate expansion. Therefore, 50% of the marks in these styles of questions are awarded for the appropriate expansion. The key message in responding to the extended writing questions is that learners should be able to consider the pros and cons of each point that they make and provide some sort of exemplification. Learners should be encouraged to undertake evaluative work wherever possible, both in relation to the topics being studied and their working practices. Please note that this part of the presentation is dealing with delivery strategies and best practice. We have found that planning is key for the successful delivery of the external units. Specification coverage. Concentrate on each section of the specification. For example, each learning aim is split into topic areas. Focus on each of the specific topic areas. For example, Learning Aims A. First topic area is Computer and Technology Systems. Learners should be able to apply this knowledge to a range of scenarios, specification rider statements, and indicative content. When asking the learner to carry out research into a topic area, ask them to look at the how and why, rather than just using. The learner should be familiar with the technical requirements of the topic areas and use their experience where possible and appropriate. Each of the topic areas should be covered in depth, so that the learner is able to provide a good depth of response for that specific topic area, at all levels from pass to distinction. For example, the question might be in a form of a multi-choice question or one of the extended writing questions towards the end of the paper. Sample assessment materials. A live test interface is available online for the learners to become familiar with the test platform. Sample assessment material for Unit 2 is available for the learners to practice exam timings and techniques. Question papers. A variety of retired tests are available online, but consider creating your own paper-based exam papers. Pick a single topic area, for example, the need to synchronize data held on devices forming a PAN, and create questions for each of the levels. For example, a multi-choice question, a short response question, and an extended writing question. When writing the answers for your own question paper, it is important to make sure that the answers allow the learner to see the depth of response required at each level. Identify, evaluate, discuss, etc. And the depth of technical response and specification coverage required. Published resources. A variety of published resources providing guidance on exam preparation is available. Mark schemes. Mark schemes for all of the retired tests are available online. Chief Examiner reports. You will find a Chief Examiner report for each of the retired tests online. The Chief Examiner report has been written by the lead examiner of Unit 2. It is designed to help you understand how learners performed on this test. The report provides an analysis of learner responses for each question and example learner responses with commentary. Test entry. Enter learners when they are fully prepared, so they will be able to achieve the higher mark bands. They should have sound subject skills and exam techniques. The planning of the test is also important. We have found that learners perform better towards the end of the course. However, sufficient time should also be planned for retakes. This link might be useful. This slide includes detail of where further support is available. This is the key web page for customers to be aware of for support and guidance with BTEC results. For further guidance and support with the delivery and assessment of BTEC, please follow the links provided on the slide. Can I take a moment to thank you for attending this pre-recorded event? I hope that you find it useful in the delivery of Unit 2 technology systems, and that you have experienced how learners performed in the exam, considered different delivery strategies, understood why learners underperformed in some questions, seen how the lead examiner's report reported on learners' responses, addressed common issues in delivery, found out about further support available.